She grabbed the wine glass, tilted it without a single word, and poured the entire thing deep red cold, humiliating, directly over his head. The whole rooftop went silent. 500 people. Not one of them moved. And the man sitting there? He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't even stand up. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face like she had spilled water on a sidewalk. Then he made one phone call. 12 hours later, a $3.2 billion contract was dead. And she had no idea she'd just destroyed her husband's empire with a glass of Merlot. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss where this one goes. The envelope had been sitting on Caleb Walker's kitchen counter for 11 days. He kept walking past it, making coffee past it, helping his daughter Lily with her homework past it, telling himself he'd open it when the time felt right. The time never felt right. It was a formal invitation, cream-colored, gold-embossed lettering, the kind you didn't fold and stuff in your back pocket. The Grand Pacific Hotel, San Francisco's highest rooftop. A gala celebrating the finalization of what the press was already calling the largest private health technology partnership in West Coast history. $3.2 billion. His name was on that deal. Not as a guest, not as a vendor, not as a consultant they'd hired to clean up someone else's mess. As the man whose company made the deal possible in the first place. He'd have been perfectly content to skip it, honestly. Caleb Walker had never been a rooftop kind of man. He was a 6 a.m. kind of man. A packed lunch, 11-hour workday, help Lily with algebra before bed kind of man. Gallus made him feel like he was wearing a costume. Everyone performing a version of themselves that cost more than it was worth. But his board had been clear. Caleb, you need to be there. You don't show up, it sends a message. What message? That you don't care about the partnership. I care about the work, not the party celebrating the work. Those two things are the same thing to these people. He'd stared at the phone after that call ended, sitting in the quiet of his home office while Lily slept down the hall. A framed photo on his desk caught his eye, the one from 4 years ago, right after everything had fallen apart. Lily was 7, gap-toothed, wearing a purple jacket 2 sizes too big, because he'd bought it on clearance and figured she'd grow into it. She was grinning, like the world owed her everything good. He was grinning too, even though behind that smile he'd been running on 4 hours of sleep, grief he hadn't processed, and a company that existed mostly on faith and stubbornness. He picked up the invitation and finally opened it. You are cordially invited. He set it back down. Lily. He knocked on her door. Hey, Lilybug. A long pause. I'm sleeping. You just answered me. I'm sleep-talking. He pushed the door open. She was 11 now, sitting up in bed with a book she'd clearly been reading instead of sleeping, caught completely. She had her mother's eyes, that had never gotten easier to look at and probably never would. I have to go to a thing next Friday. She looked at him over the top of the book. What kind of thing? A work thing, at a hotel. It's formal. Are you going to wear the navy suit? It's my only suit. It has a thing on the sleeve. I had it repaired. You repaired it instead of buying a new one? It's a good suit. It just needed some attention. She studied him for a moment with the unsettling seriousness that 11-year-olds sometimes deployed without warning. Dad, are you important? The question landed differently than she'd meant it. He knew that. She was just asking the way kids ask things directly, without the coating of tact that adults spend years learning to apply. But it sat in his chest for a second before he answered. I'm important to you. I'm serious. So am I, like at work. Are you important at work? He leaned against the doorframe. Why are you asking? Because Mrs. Henley asked us to write about someone we admire, and I wrote about you, and she said I should pick someone more recognizable, and I didn't know if that meant you weren't important, or if Mrs. Henley just doesn't know about you yet. He crossed the room, sat on the edge of her bed, and took the book out of her hands gently. You wrote about me? You're the only person I actually know well enough to admire. Everyone else I'd be copying from Wikipedia. He laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. He hadn't laughed like that in a couple of days, and he hadn't realized it until it happened. What did you write? That you built a company from nothing. That you do it to help people who can't afford to get help. That you never complain even when things are hard. That you make really bad eggs, but you try every single Sunday. The eggs are getting better. They're really not, Lily. They're objectively bad, Dad. There's no universe where those eggs are getting better. He laughed again. She smiled. Then her face shifted into something softer, something that looked older than 11. Are you going to be okay at that party? Why wouldn't I be okay? Because you hate parties. I don't hate parties. You called Jenna's birthday party last summer an elaborate performance of joy. That was different context. Dad, he looked at her. Wear the navy suit. It looks good. The repaired part doesn't even show. And if anyone's rude to you, remember what you always tell me. What do I always tell you? That the way people treat you when they think you don't matter is the most honest thing they'll ever show you. He was quiet for a second. When did I say that? When Tyler Brentwood told me my science project was dumb in 5th grade. Right, he nodded slowly. Tyler Brentwood. He failed the science fair. I got second place. You got second place, which is almost first. Which is almost first. She picked her book back up. The conversation apparently was over. He stood, kissed the top of her head, and walked back toward the door. Dad, yeah, you're important. Even if Mrs. Henley doesn't know yet. He wore the navy suit. He took his own car. No driver, no assistant. He'd offered to take a cab, but his COO Marcus had looked at him like he'd suggested arriving by skateboard. At least let me arrange a car service. I have a car. Caleb Marcus, I have a car, it runs. I'll be there. He parked 2 blocks away because the valet line was backed up, and he didn't like waiting, grabbed the invitation from the passenger seat, and walked the rest of the way. The night air was cool and clean. The way San Francisco nights sometimes were that particular Salton City smell that reminded him of the early days, when he'd worked out of a 2-room office near the bay and eaten the same deli sandwich for lunch 6 days out of 7 because it was close and cheap and he had more important things to spend money thinking about. The Grand Pacific was exactly the kind of building that announced itself. All vertical glass and golden light bleeding out from the lobby, a line of luxury cars at the entrance, a doorman in a coat that probably cost more than Caleb's monthly grocery budget. He joined the line. Showed his invitation. The doorman glanced at it. Then at him. Then back at it, with a particular kind of assessment that Caleb recognized immediately, the slow look that people gave when they were trying to reconcile what they expected with what was standing in front of them. Walker? That's right, another look. Go right in, sir. The elevator opened to the rooftop. And the rooftop was a lot. Strings of warm light above a crowd of 500. Servers moving through with champagne flutes. The city stretched out in every direction, which was undeniably beautiful. But the beauty of the view felt secondary to the performance happening underneath it. Everyone dressed in the specific way that said, I spent a significant amount of money to appear effortless. The conversations were loud in that particular way that meant everyone was really listening to themselves. He stood at the edge of it for a moment, got a glass of water from a passing server, and moved to find his seat. Table 7, corner placement. He'd specifically requested it. Marcus had called that a mistake. Corner tables look like you're being hidden. I like corners. People will think, Marcus. I'm not going to the gala to manage perceptions. I'm going because you told me I had to go. Let me sit where I want to sit. He found table 7, set down his water, and pulled out his phone to check on a message from the engineering team, a device prototype that had cleared its testing phase, which was the actual news worth celebrating that week. The news nobody at this rooftop event would care about. He typed back a quick response. Good work. Full review Monday. Excuse me. He looked up. The woman standing across the table was the kind of beautiful that came with visible infrastructure, not natural, not artificial, but maintained, like an estate that had been tended to so carefully for so long that it no longer resembled anything accidental. Late 40s. A dress that had a name he wouldn't have recognized. Diamonds that caught the light in a way that felt almost aggressive. And an expression that she had probably spent years perfecting, the particular look of someone who has decided, before a single word is spoken, exactly how a situation is going to go. Victoria Ashford. He knew who she was. He'd done his homework. Wife of Richard Ashford, founder of Ashford Capital, whose firm was the lead investor on the other side of the $3.2 billion deal. Significant philanthropic presence. A woman who appeared at the top of lists best dressed, most influential, San Francisco power couples, with enough consistency that the lists had stopped feeling like news. He had not expected her to walk over to him. He stood up because that was the polite thing to do, and extended his hand. "Good evening." She did not take his hand. Instead, she looked at the name card, then at his suit, then at his face, with the slow deliberateness of someone performing a calculation. "I think there may be a seating error." "I don't think so. Table 7, seat 4, that's me. This section is reserved for primary partners and board members." "I'm aware, and you are." He held her gaze. He wasn't going to say it. Not because he was hiding anything, but because the question itself, delivered the way she delivered it, with that particular weight of "who on earth do you think you are," was its own kind of test. And he had learned, over a long time, that the most useful thing you could do when someone tested you that way was to let the test play out. Let people show you who they were. Let the silence do the work. Caleb Walker. She waited for more. He didn't give her more. Her eyes moved over him again. The suit. The absence of any identifiable watch brand. Cufflinks. The accessories that would have communicated, in the language she was fluent in, who he was and whether he was worth her time. "I don't believe I've seen you at any of the previous events. I don't usually attend these types of events. And yet here you are, at table 7, and yet here I am." Something shifted in her expression. Not softening, sharpening. "I'm going to speak with the event coordinator about the seating arrangement." "That's your prerogative." She walked away. He sat back down, picked up his phone, and continued reading the engineering report. She came back 20 minutes later. He'd watched her, from the corner of his eye, work through 3 different people. A woman he guessed was the event coordinator, a man in a headset who looked like hotel management, a server who had the particular misfortune of being nearby. Each conversation was brief. Each person nodded, looked over in his direction, looked back at her, and then apparently said something she didn't like. Because each time she walked away, looking slightly more coiled. When she came back to the table, she didn't sit down. She stood behind the chair across from him, one hand resting on its back, and she looked at him with an expression that had crossed over from assessment into something more openly hostile. "They confirmed your invitation is legitimate." "It is. I still find it unusual." "The primary partner seats typically go to." She stopped, reconsidered her phrasing. "To individuals with a specific standing in the deal." "I have specific standing in the deal. In what capacity?" He set his phone down, looked at her directly. "In the capacity that's listed on my invitation." A beat of silence. "You're being deliberately vague." "I'm answering your questions. I'm just not answering more than I'm asked." She studied him for a long moment. And then she did something he recognized immediately, the slight tilt of the head, the way the eyes moved to scan the room quickly, checking to see who was watching. This was no longer just about him. This was about the audience. There were people at nearby tables who had tuned in. Not overtly. Nobody in rooms like this ever looked directly at conflict. They looked adjacent to it, but he could feel the attention shifting. She had felt it too, and she had made a choice. She reached for the wine glass that a server had just filled at the table, beside her deep red. A Merlot, nearly full, and she held it in a way that was not casual, not accidental, and absolutely deliberate. "Let me offer you a suggestion." Her voice was quiet, controlled, almost pleasant, the way a threat can be delivered pleasantly when the person delivering it has practiced. "There are other tables, quieter ones, less central. I think you'd be more comfortable there. You'd be among people who are," she smiled, "more at your level." He looked at her. She was still holding the glass. He said nothing. She tilted it. The Merlot came down over his shoulder, soaked the lapel of the navy suit, spread dark and cold across the fabric before he could move. Not that he did move. He didn't flinch. He didn't stand. He didn't say anything for 3 full seconds, while the wine dripped from the edge of his jacket and the entire surrounding area of the rooftop went absolutely, completely, deafeningly silent. 500 people. Not one breath. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out the folded white handkerchief. He always carried his father's habit, passed down without discussion. One of those things you absorb from a man without ever deciding to, and he pressed it against his face first. Then the lapel, slow, methodical, unhurried. Then he looked up at her. She was still holding the empty glass. The expression on her face had not changed. She had expected something. Embarrassment, anger, the scrambling of a man caught in a situation he couldn't handle. She was prepared for any of those. She was not prepared for what he actually gave her, which was stillness, and a voice so quiet, and even that people at the adjacent tables would later say they had to lean in to hear it. "Thank you. You just showed me everything I needed to know." She opened her mouth, then closed it. He folded the handkerchief, tucked it away, stood from the table, and walked not quickly, not dramatically, not performing anything to the far edge of the rooftop where the lights were lower, and the city stretched out in the dark below. He took out his phone. He made one call. It lasted 43 seconds. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anything. He didn't explain. He said 3 words before hanging up. "I've seen enough," and then proceed. Back at the table, Victoria set the empty wine glass down and turned to find the people around her suddenly absorbed in conversations that had nothing to do with her. Nobody met her eye. Nobody laughed. Nobody validated what had just happened. The room had gone quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone present understands that something irreversible has just occurred, and nobody is certain yet what it will cost. She smoothed her dress. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself the man in the repaired navy suit, now standing alone at the edge of the rooftop, looking at his phone without any visible distress, was exactly what she had decided he was when she first saw him. Nothing. Nobody. A name on an invitation that shouldn't have been there. She picked up a fresh glass from a server's tray, took a sip, and turned back to find her husband Richard across the room deep in a conversation with 2 board members. She did not know, in that moment, that Richard's phone was about to start ringing. She did not know that the first call would come in 4 minutes. She did not know who was calling. But she would. She would know everything. Within the hour, she would know exactly who Clabe Walker was. And by morning, she would understand what those 43 seconds had cost her. Richard Ashford's phone rang at 9:47 p.m. He was mid-sentence, something about projected returns in the secondary market. A conversation he'd been having with 2 board members from Pacific Meridian Group. The kind of conversation that happened at these events where the real business got done, in the margins, away from the speeches and the catered appetizers. He held up one finger, the universal signal, "Forgive me a moment," and glanced at the screen. The number was from Daniel Foss, his general counsel. "At 9:47 on a Friday night," he answered. "Daniel, I'm in the middle of—" "Richard, I need 2 minutes. Right now." Something in Daniel's voice made him step away from the 2 board members without excusing himself, which was not a thing Richard Ashford typically did. He moved toward the far side of the rooftop, away from the speakers, away from the crowd. What happened? Not a question, a statement. Richard had been in business long enough to know that a call from general counsel on a Friday night was not a social event. "We've received formal notification that Walker Technologies is invoking a review clause." Richard stopped walking. "Say that again." "Section 14C of the partnership agreement. The Conduct and Reputational Integrity Clause. They're invoking it. Effective immediately. The $3.2 billion contract is suspended pending a full internal review." The noise of the rooftop kept going around him, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the hum of 500 people who didn't know yet. But Richard heard none of it. "That's not possible. We've been through 6 months of negotiation. The signing ceremony is next week. Was next week." "Richard, on whose authority?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel significant. "Caleb Walker. He called Marcus Chen 40 minutes ago. The review notice hit our legal team 8 minutes after that. It's official. It's clean. It's airtight." Richard turned slowly, instinctively, the way a man turns when he knows the answer is somewhere in the room and he just hasn't found it yet. His eyes moved across the rooftop, past the servers, past the board members, past the guests, still laughing at whatever was funny, until they found Victoria. She was standing near the center of the room with a fresh glass of wine. And then his eyes moved past her to the edge of the rooftop, to the man in the navy suit, who was standing alone, looking out at the city, his back to the crowd, still and completely unhurried, like a man who had already said everything that needed saying and was waiting patiently for the world to catch up. Daniel, I'm going to call you back. He ended the call before Daniel could respond and put the phone in his pocket. Then he walked toward his wife. Victoria saw him coming and read his face immediately, the way you read the face of a man you've been married to for 22 years. She knew all his expressions: the boardroom face, the charity dinner face, the face he wore when a deal was going sideways, the face he wore when he was about to say something he'd been rehearsing in his head for the last 30 seconds. This was a face she didn't have a name for. Richard, come with me, right now. I'm in the middle of... Victoria. His voice was low, the kind of low that was quieter than shouting and significantly more serious. Right now. She set her glass down and followed him to a corner of the rooftop near the elevator bank, where the music was dampened and the nearest guests were 15 feet away. He turned to face her. What did you do tonight? She kept her expression neutral. 22 years of charity galas and boardroom dinners had given her a particular skill for this. The composed face, the appropriate pause before speaking, the appearance of calm. I don't know what you're referring to. Victoria, I had a conversation with someone who appeared to be... Did you pour wine on Caleb Walker? The name landed differently than she expected. Not the act, the name, the specific, deliberate use of the full name. She replayed the evening in her head. The man at table 7. The navy suit, the handkerchief. She had never caught his last name when he'd introduced himself. Just Caleb. Just a first name said quietly, like it didn't need any support from anything else. I don't know who that is. Richard looked at her for a long moment. He's the majority owner of Walker Technologies. She didn't move. He controls 63% of the company, which means he has final authority over the partnership agreement. Which means... Richard paused, pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, the gesture he always made when he was working to stay composed. The $3.2 billion deal that I have spent the last 6 months building. The deal that we are celebrating tonight. The deal that was supposed to be signed on Thursday, he just suspended it. On the basis of a conduct review. And he stopped. Started again. I need you to tell me exactly what happened at that table. She was quiet. Not because she didn't have an answer. She had several answers. In fact, answers she had already assembled. The moment she'd seen his expression coming toward her. But she was running the calculations quickly, the way she always did, deciding which version of the evening was the correct version to present. He was sitting at table 7. He was supposed to be sitting at table 7. That was his seat. He didn't look. She caught herself. He didn't look what? He didn't present as a primary partner. Richard stared at her. What does that mean? He wasn't Richard. The man had no watch. No, he doesn't wear a watch. That's a personal preference. What did you do, Victoria? She lifted her chin slightly. Just slightly. But he knew her well enough to see it, the micro-adjustment of posture. That meant she had made a decision about how this conversation was going to go. I suggested he might be more comfortable at a different table. In a way that I may have misjudged the situation. But the response seems disproportionate too. You poured wine on him. It was an accident. In front of 480 people and at least 2 camera crews from the financial press. An accident. She said nothing. Richard turned away from her, both hands on the railing, looking out at the city. She watched his shoulders. She had learned to read his shoulders the way some people read faces, the set of them, the tension, something in them, what they did when he was working through something he hadn't yet decided how to solve. He was very still. Do you understand what Section 14C is? I'm not familiar with the specific. It's a clause I agreed to during negotiations, because Walker Technologies insisted on it. A personal conduct clause. It gives Walker the right to suspend or terminate the partnership if any principal party or immediate family member of a principal party engages in conduct that materially affects the reputational integrity of the agreement. He turned back to face her. You are my immediate family. What you did tonight in public, on camera, To the man who has to sign off on this deal, that is the definition of material, reputational damage. Richard, $3.2 billion, Victoria. I understand the number. I don't think you do. Because if you understood the number, you would have walked up to that table, introduced yourself, and shaken the man's hand. Even if he'd shown up in jeans and a baseball cap, even if he'd shown up in pajamas, you would have shaken his hand. Because that is what adults do when they are trying to build something. Her jaw tightened. You're blaming me. I'm describing what happened. He was sitting at a table he had no visible. He had every right to be there. He earned the right to sit wherever he wanted at that table, because without him, there is no table. There is no gala. There is no $3.2 billion. Richard's voice had dropped even lower, which was worse than it being loud. You humiliated him, publicly, on camera, and now I have to figure out how to save 6 months of work before Thursday. He straightened his jacket, the automatic gesture of a man composing himself before walking back into a room. Don't talk to anyone tonight. Don't say anything to anyone about what happened. I'm going to find Walker and try to have a conversation. You're going to go apologize for me. I'm going to try to do damage control. There's a difference. He walked away before she could answer. Richard moved through the crowd. With the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating rooms full of important people, he nodded to faces he recognized, deflected conversations with 2 words, and a hand gesture kept moving. He found Marcus Chen first. Marcus was Walker Technologies' CEO, a compact, precise man in his late 40s, who Richard had dealt with extensively over the 6 months of negotiation, who was generally unflappable, who was right now, standing near the bar, holding a glass of water and looking at his phone, with an expression that suggested he was not at the gala in any meaningful sense anymore. Marcus looked up. The expression on his face was not unfriendly. It was careful, measured, the expression of a man who knew exactly what was happening and had decided to be professionally neutral about it. Richard, I need to speak with Caleb, I understand. Is he? Richard glanced around. I saw him on the edge of the terrace. He's still there. Will he? Is this something that can be talked through tonight? Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his water glass, then back up. I'll be honest with you, Richard, because I think honesty is what the situation calls for. Caleb doesn't make decisions like this, emotionally. He doesn't invoke a clause like 14C because his feelings were hurt. He invokes it because he's seen something that tells him something about how a partnership is going to function long-term. He paused. What happened at that table tonight that wasn't just about him? He's thinking about how the people he partnered with make decisions when they think no one important is watching. Richard absorbed this, so talking to him tonight is absolutely worth doing. He's a fair man. I've worked with him for 9 years, and I can tell you he doesn't hold grudges. But if you go over there looking for a quick fix, he'll know that too. He's good at reading what people actually want. Richard nodded slowly. Thank you, Marcus. He found Caleb at the far edge of the rooftop, exactly where she'd spotted him from across the room. The man was standing at the railing, looking out at the city, hands in his pockets. Not hiding, not watching the crowd over his shoulder. Just standing there, in the quiet, with the particular ease of someone who genuinely did not need the room to be looking at him in order to feel like he existed. It was an unusual quality in a man of his position. It made Richard feel, for the first time that evening, slightly off balance. Mr. Walker. Caleb turned. His face was open, not cold, not performatively warm, not guarded in the way of someone who was rehearsing something. He looked at Richard with the same unhurried attention he'd given the engineering report. Earlier, Mr. Ashford. I want to apologize for what happened tonight. I appreciate that. What my wife did was, Richard searched for the right word. Several presented themselves, none of them adequate. Unacceptable. Completely and entirely unacceptable. And I want you to know that it doesn't reflect. Richard, the first name, used easily, without aggression, cutting through the prepared statement without being rude about it. I've heard this part. The part where someone explains that the behavior was an anomaly, that it doesn't reflect the real character of the person. I don't need to hear that part. Richard stopped. What part do you need to hear? Caleb turned back toward the city for a moment. The lights spread out below them, the bay, the bridges, the grid of streets running to the waterfront. San Francisco at night, from this height, looked like a circuit board, lit from inside. I've been in business for 15 years, and I've learned that the thing worth paying attention to isn't how people treat you when the deal is on the line. It's how they treat you when they think the deal is already done, when they think there's nothing you can take back, when they think they've already won. He was quiet for a beat. The deal wasn't done tonight, she thought it was. That's the problem. Richard listened. He was good at listening when listening was what the situation required, and this was that situation. What happened at that table tells me something about decision-making culture, about what values look like when they're not being performed for an audience. I'm not interested in punishing anyone. I want to understand whether the culture I'm looking at is one I can build something with. He finally turned back to face Richard. That's what the review is about, not the wine. The wine is a data point. And if the review, Richard chose his words with care. What would a positive outcome look like to you? Caleb almost smiled. Not quite, just the edge of it. That's not a tonight conversation. I understand. But I want you to know that I'm taking this seriously. I know you are. The call from your general counsel came 8 minutes after my office sent the notice. That's fast for a Friday night. That tells me you're paying attention. I've been paying attention for 6 months. I know that too. Caleb looked at him steadily. The question I'm sitting with is whether the right people are making the right decisions, and whether, when the wrong decision gets made, the right people are willing to say so. Richard held his gaze. He understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had built enough things to know when he was standing at a critical juncture, that this was not a conversation he could close tonight. This was a conversation he could only begin. I won't take more of your evening, but I want to say one thing clearly and directly. Caleb waited. What my wife did was wrong, not legally wrong, not procedurally wrong, wrong. She saw a man and made a judgment about his value before she knew anything about him, and she acted on that judgment in a way that was cruel. That's the accurate description. And I should have in 22 years. He stopped, started again. I should have made it clearer to her, over a long time, that that's not who we are. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly in Caleb's expression. It was not softening exactly. It was more like recognition. The look of a man who has heard a lot of explanations and apologies and has become very good at distinguishing between the ones that are constructed and the ones that are real. He extended his hand. Richard shook it. Monday morning, Caleb said. My office. We'll have the conversation we need to have. I'll be there. Caleb nodded once, turned back toward the city, and that was the end of the conversation, not abruptly, not rudely, but definitively, the way a chapter ends. Richard walked away feeling something he hadn't felt in the middle of a business crisis in a very long time. He felt like he'd been assessed, and he wasn't entirely sure of the result. The room had moved on in the way that rooms move on from things loudly, by pretending the thing hadn't happened. The speeches had started. Someone was at the microphone talking about innovation and partnership and the future of American healthcare technology, and 500 people were holding their glasses and nodding at the appropriate moments. And the servers were still moving through the crowd with their trays, and the lights were still warm and golden overhead. But underneath all of it, in the specific social frequency that ran below the official event, things were moving. Thomas Brightwell noticed it first. He was 44, senior managing partner at Meridian Capital, and he had the social antenna of someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where the real conversations happened at the margins. He'd been 3 tables away when the wine had come down. He'd seen the whole thing not clearly, he'd only caught the edge of it, but enough to understand the geometry. A woman, a glass, a man who did not react the way men usually react. He found his partner James Cho near the bar. Did you see what happened at table 7? I saw some of it. Ashford's wife did something. She poured wine on the guy. James turned to look at him fully, poured, tilted the glass. Deliberately, in front of everyone. Who's the guy? Thomas paused. He'd been trying to place it for the last 20 minutes. The name on the invitation, the seating chart he'd glanced at when he'd arrived. Walker Technologies. The company on the other side of the deal, they were all here celebrating. Caleb Walker. James said nothing for 2 seconds. Walker. As in Walker Technologies. As in the Walker on the partnership agreement. That's my understanding. And she. James looked toward the center of the room where Victoria was now standing with a small group of women, laughing at something, fully recomposed, as though the last 40 minutes hadn't happened. She poured wine on him, full glass, Merlot. How did he react? He wiped his face, said something to her, and then walked away and made a phone call. James was quiet. What kind of phone call? I don't know. But Richard Ashford's had his phone out every 5 minutes since. And I haven't been able to get Marcus Chen to make eye contact with me. Which? Thomas paused meaningfully. Marcus always makes eye contact. The man is incapable of avoiding a conversation. James turned the glass in his hand slowly. Has anyone confirmed what the call was about? Not officially. But I had Daniel Foss brush past me on the way to the elevator 20 minutes ago, and Daniel doesn't come to Gallus, the general counsel, at 10 p.m. on a Friday. They looked at each other. The deal, James said. That would be my read. They just spent 6 months on that deal. 7, actually, and 3.2 billion. James set his glass down on the bar. I need to make a call. You and everyone else in this room who's figured it out. By 10:30, the information had moved through the rooftop the way information always moved through rooms like this, not announced, not confirmed, just absorbed, person by person, through the particular osmosis of people who were very good at reading the small signals. A hushed conversation near the elevator, the sight of 2 executives stepping away from the main crowd with their phones. The way Richard Ashford's demeanor had changed, not obviously, not to anyone who didn't know what to look for, but to anyone paying attention. He was a man who was managing something. And Victoria. The people nearest her began, slowly and without discussion, to drift away. Not rudely, not dramatically. The way people drift when they've recalculated the social coordinates of a room and decided that proximity to a particular person has become complicated. A conversation ended. Another began slightly farther away. The group around her thinned from 6 to 4 to 2, and then it was just her and a woman named Sandra Hartley, who was too polite to leave abruptly, and too aware of the situation to say anything useful. Victoria felt it. She was not a woman who missed social signals. She had spent too many years reading rooms to be oblivious to what was happening in this one. But she told herself it was the hour late enough that conversations were winding down, that people were making their exits. She told herself the thin feeling at the edge of the crowd was coincidence. Sandra excused herself to find the restroom, and Victoria stood alone for the first time that evening. She scanned the room. Richard was across the space in conversation with 2 board members she recognized from previous events. His body language was controlled, contained the specific body language of Richard Ashford, working a problem. She had seen it enough times to know it wasn't social conversation. He was managing something. She looked toward the edge of the terrace. Caleb Walker was still there, still at the railing. A different man had joined him. She didn't recognize him immediately, but something about the posture, the way he was leaning in and listening, suggested he wasn't a stranger. She watched for a moment. The second man nodded, said something. Caleb responded. The man nodded again, more slowly this time, and then straightened up and walked back toward the main crowd. Caleb remained at the railing. He hadn't looked at her once since the incident. That bothered her more than she expected it to. She was used to people looking at her. Even people who were angry with her looked at her. That was the nature of the influence she'd built over 20 years. The particular gravity of being someone who mattered in every room she entered. People looked at her when they were happy to see her. They looked at her when they were afraid of her. They looked at her when they wanted something from her. The man at the railing had not looked at her once, as though she had already become irrelevant. She picked up a glass from a passing tray, took a sip, and told herself she was imagining things. Told herself the review clause was procedural. Told herself Richard would handle it. Richard handled everything. That was the arrangement. That was how it had always worked. Her phone buzzed. A text from her friend Carolyn Marsh, who was across the room, and had apparently seen enough of the evening to have formed an opinion about it. What happened at that table? Everyone's talking. Victoria stared at the message. Everyone's talking. She put the phone in her clutch without responding and looked across the room again. At table 7, which was empty now, she could see the faint dark stain on the white tablecloth, where the wine had spilled when the glass had been tilted. A server had attempted to blot it, but not entirely successfully. The stain was still there, a dark red oval on white linen. She looked away. At 10:52 p.m., Jeffrey Marsh, Carolyn's husband, a partner at one of the law firms that had worked on the deal documentation, stepped outside the elevator doors on the lobby level and answered a call from his colleague, Adrian Wells, who was still upstairs at the gala. "Tell me it's not what I think it is," Jeffrey said. "Depends on what you think it is. I think it's 14C. A pause on the line. "It's 14C. Jeffrey walked toward the hotel exit. "Full suspension?" "Full suspension pending review." Notice went to Ashford Capital's legal team at 9:55. "Who signed off on the suspension?" "Walker himself." "Direct authorization." Jeffrey pushed through the revolving door into the cool night air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, who else knows?" "Upstairs, hard to say. It's moving fast." Chen isn't talking. Ashford was on his phone for 20 minutes, and he looked. Adrian paused, apparently choosing his words. He looked like a man who'd been told his house was on fire. Does Walker know the scope? Does he understand what a review kicks off? Jeffrey. He wrote the clause. He negotiated it personally. He knows exactly what it kicks off. Jeffrey turned back toward the hotel entrance. The doorman held the door. He nodded. "Then this isn't an accident, and it's not a warning shot. That's my read too. He's serious. He was always serious. We just weren't paying attention to the right things." The gala began to thin around 11 p.m. The official close of the event was midnight, but the energy had drained out of the evening in the hour between 10 and 11 in a way that had nothing to do with the time. The speeches had concluded, the awards had been presented, and the ambient knowledge that something had gone wrong, even among people who didn't know. Specifics had introduced a subtle sobriety into the room that champagne couldn't quite counteract. People began saying their goodbyes. The goodbyes near Victoria were brief. Not rude, nobody was rude, but brief. The particular brevity of people who had recalculated where she adjusted accordingly, handshakes instead of embraces, polite, smiles instead of warm ones, one conversations that ended after 2 exchanges instead of 5. She absorbed all of it with perfect composure. Because Victoria Ashford had learned in 22 years of navigating rooms like this that the most important thing you could do when the ground shifted was to make sure nobody saw you stumble. You kept your posture, you kept your smile, you kept your chin level and your movements unhurried, and your face perfectly, serenely composed. She kept all of it. But inside, behind all of it, something had started to understand. Not fully. Not yet. The full understanding would come in stages a little more tonight, when Richard finally told her the details. A little more tomorrow when her phone started going quiet in the way that influential people's phones went quiet when they were being quietly edged out of conversations. More still on Monday morning, when the news made it to the circles she moved in. But even now, standing at the edge of the thinning gala, watching the servers begin to clear the tables, watching the golden lights above her dim slightly as the event wound down, she felt the first of it. A shift, subtle, tectonic, the feeling of solid ground adjusting beneath your feet. She looked one more time toward the terrace railing. Caleb Walker was gone. She hadn't seen him leave. He'd simply, at some point in the last hour, between all the phone calls and the brief goodbyes and the thinning crowd, he had walked away. No announcement, no scene, no final look across the room. Just gone. The way powerful things sometimes moved quietly, without warning, and entirely on their own terms. Richard found her at 11:15. He appeared at her side, placed one hand briefly on her lower back in the automatic gesture of a man who had stood beside his wife in public for 2 decades, and said quietly, very close to her ear, "The car is ready, let's go." She set her glass down. They walked together toward the elevator, maintaining the smooth presentation of a couple who were simply leaving at a reasonable hour like everyone else, maintaining the practiced ease of 2 people who had long ago learned to be a unit in public regardless of what was happening between them privately. The elevator doors closed. Richard looked straight ahead. Tell me everything that happened at that table. I already told you. Victoria. He turned to look at her. His face in the elevator light was tired. Not angry, she'd seen him angry. And this was something different. He looked tired in the way people looked tired when they were working very hard to hold something together and weren't sure yet whether they would manage it. I need the truth. Not the version. The truth. Because on Monday morning I'm sitting across from that man, and I need to walk into that room with a complete picture of what happened. So please. She was quiet for the length of 3 floors descending. Then she told him. Not everything all at once. In the way you tell things when you're not sure what the other person already knows, when you're monitoring the face across from you for each detail's impact. The moment she'd seen him at the table, the assumption she'd made, the coordinator, the hotel manager, the conversation, the glass. Richard listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react visibly to any single piece of it. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. They walked through the lobby, through the revolving door, into the cool San Francisco night where the car was waiting. The driver opened the door. They got in. The door closed. Richard sat with his hands in his lap, looking out the window as the car pulled away from the Grand Pacific and onto the quiet street. He said something to you. Before he walked away. Yes, what did he say? She had been turning those words over in her mind for the last 2 hours. The flat, even delivery of them. The way he'd said them without heat, without performance, as though they were simply a statement of fact. Thank you. You just showed me everything I needed to know. She repeated them. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Opened them. He meant it literally. I know, she said. And she did. That was the part she couldn't argue with, even to herself. Even in the versions where she'd tried to reframe what had happened, to place the weight of it somewhere else, she kept coming back to those 8 words, and she couldn't find the version of them that meant something other than what they meant. The car moved through the city. For the next several minutes, neither of them said anything. The streets slid past the window, the lit restaurants, and the late pedestrians, and the ordinary Friday night of a city that did not know and did not particularly care what had happened on the rooftop of the Grand Pacific Hotel. What happens Monday? She asked. I sit across from a man I need to rebuild trust with, and I try to do that, and if you can't. He was quiet for a moment. Then $3.2 billion and 6 months of work end because of a glass of wine. A pause. And we live with that. I didn't know who he was. I know you didn't. If I had known, I know. His voice was still even. Still tired. But that's not the part I'm going to spend a lot of time on, Victoria. Because the part that keeps staying with me, and I don't say this to be cruel, I say it. Because it's true, is that it shouldn't have mattered. Who he was, what he owned, what he controlled. He turned to look at her in the dark of the car. It shouldn't have changed anything. She didn't answer. Because she didn't have an answer. Not a real one. Across the city, in a quiet neighborhood where the streets were dark and the houses had porch lights, and the Friday night felt like exactly what it was. The end of a week, a light was still on in an upstairs window. Lily Walker had waited up. She heard the car pull into the driveway, heard the click of the lock, heard her father's familiar footsteps on the stairs, the sound she knew better than almost any sound in the world. The particular cadence of a man who walked deliberately, who never rushed, who took the stairs the same way every time. His head appeared around her door. You're awake. I was waiting. Lily, how was it? He stood in the doorway. He'd taken off the jacket somewhere. She could see the white dress shirt, slightly rumpled, the undone top button. His face was the face she knew. Calm. The kind of calm that wasn't the absence of something, but the presence of something, the settled quality of a man who had been tested and had held. It was interesting, he said. Good interesting or bad interesting? He considered this, with the seriousness she had asked for. Both, probably more good than bad in the long run. Did anything happen? He looked at her for a moment. His daughter, the reason. The whole entire reason for everything, not abstractly, not as a concept, but specifically and completely. The gap-toothed girl in the purple jacket who had become this 11-year-old, who waited up for him and asked real questions. Something happened, he said. but nothing that can't be handled. Is the suit okay? He glanced down at himself, almost smiled. The suit had a hard night. What happened to it? Someone spilled something on it. Someone spilled something? Or someone spilled something? He looked at her. Sometimes she was exactly her mother, the precision of the question, the way she aimed directly at the thing. Someone made a choice, he said, and the choice told me something useful. And I made a decision based on what I learned. And now it's being handled. What kind of decision? A work one. You'll hear about it when it's done. She pulled her knees up to her chest, studying him the way she always studied him when she was deciding whether she had the complete picture or whether more questions were needed. Were you okay at the party? I was okay. Did you remember what I said? He looked at her. The way people treat you when they think you don't matter, she said, is the most honest thing they'll ever show you. He was quiet for a moment. I remembered, he said. She seemed satisfied with that. She settled back against her pillow, reached for her book she'd never actually stopped reading, just paused it and opened it to her page. Okay, she said. Good night, Dad. Good night, Lilybug. He pulled her door almost closed, left the inch of light she preferred, the inch of light they'd maintained since the year her mother died, the year she'd started needing to be able to see the hallway from her bed, to know the house was solid and present around her, and he stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went downstairs, sat at his kitchen table, opened his laptop, and began drafting the agenda for the Monday morning meeting that would determine the future dollars of a $3.2 billion partnership, not with anger, not with strategy aimed at punishment, or leverage, or the management of appearances, with the same deliberate, methodical focus he brought to everything that mattered, because what had happened tonight was not ultimately about wine or suits or rooftop galas or the sharp assessments of a woman who had never been told she was wrong about anything. It was about what kind of company Walker Technologies was going to build its future beside. And Caleb Walker had learned, in 38 years, and in one glass of Merlot, everything he needed to make that decision. The weekend passed the way weekends pass, when something large is pending slowly in the hours, quickly in the days, with a particular quality of waiting underneath everything else. Caleb spent Saturday at the office, not because he had to, because the engineering team had cleared their second prototype test, and he wanted to see the results in person, wanted to walk through the lab and look at the actual device small enough to fit in a palm, designed to monitor cardiac irregularities in patients who couldn't afford the clinic visits that would normally catch them, and understand, concretely, what they were building and why it mattered. He stood in the lab for 40 minutes with a young engineer named Rosa Delgado, who had joined the company 8 months ago from a program in New Mexico, who spoke about the device with the specific intensity of someone who had a personal reason for the work she was doing. Her grandmother, she'd told him in her hiring interview, had died of an undiagnosed arrhythmia at 61, in a rural county with one cardiologist serving 4 towns. He asked her questions. She answered them. She showed him the data from the second test, the accuracy rate, the false positive reduction, the battery performance over a 72-hour monitoring window. This is good work, he told her. She looked like she wanted to say something beyond thank you and settled for, we're not done yet. I know. That's why it's good. He left the lab and went back to his desk and spent the rest of the afternoon on the Monday agenda. Marcus called at 6. How are you doing? I'm fine. How's the agenda look on your end? Caleb, Marcus. I'm asking how you're doing, as a person, not as the CEO of this company. A pause. I'm fine, genuinely. It's not what happened Friday wasn't personal. That's not me being stoic about it. It actually wasn't personal. It was informative. Marcus's tone was dry. A woman poured wine on you in front of 500 people, and it was informative. It told me something I needed to know before I committed $3.2 billion of our company's future to a partnership. That's useful information. And what did it tell you? That we need Monday's conversation before we decide anything else. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Richard called me. I know, he called me too. He wants this to work. I believe him. Does that matter? Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The office was quiet, of the staff had gone home. The building had that particular late Saturday stillness that he'd always found easier to think in than the busy days. It matters. It's not sufficient on its own, but it matters. A man who wants something, and a man who's willing to change what needs to change to get it. Those aren't always the same man. Monday will tell me which one Richard Ashford is. And if he's just the first one, then we restructure the terms or we walk away. Either of those is better than finding out 2 years into a partnership. Marcus accepted this. I'll have the documentation ready by 8. Thank you, Marcus. Caleb. For what it's worth, another pause longer. You handled Friday better than anyone I know would have. Caleb was quiet. Get some sleep, he said. It's Saturday. Sunday, he made eggs. Badly, by all objective measures, but with significant commitment. Lily sat at the kitchen counter and watched him work with the expression she always wore during his cooking attempts, not unkind, but deeply skeptical, the face of someone who had eaten the evidence and formed a considered opinion. You added more butter this time, she observed. Someone told me butter fixes everything. Who told you that? I don't remember. Someone wise. It wasn't me. I would never give you cooking advice. That would be enabling, he laughed, genuinely, and flipped the eggs, and one of them broke badly in the pan, and Lily made a small sound of sympathetic dismay that made him laugh harder. They ate at the kitchen table. The eggs were objectively not good. Neither of them mentioned it. Dad, yeah. Is the work thing okay? The thing from Friday. He looked at her over his coffee cup. It's being handled. You keep saying that. Because it's true. She pushed her fork around the plate. The gesture she always made when she was building toward a real question, through smaller ones. Were you scared? When she did it. The wine thing. He set his cup down. How do you know about the wine thing? She looked at him with the particular patience of an 11-year-old dealing with a parent who had underestimated the information-gathering capacity of children. Emily Hartley's mom was at the party. Emily texted me yesterday. He absorbed this. San Francisco, he thought, was a small city in the ways that counted. No, he said, I wasn't scared. What were you? He thought about this, with the seriousness the question deserved. I was clear. That's the best word I have for it. When something like that happens, and when you're not reacting from ego, when you're not worried about what the room thinks of you, you get very clear, very fast. And what I was clear about was what I needed to do next, which was make a phone call. Emily Hartley's mom told her a lot. She has a podcast. He stared at his daughter. Emily's mom has a podcast. It's about San Francisco social events. It has 80,000 subscribers. Lily looked at him calmly. You might be on it. He picked up his coffee cup. Put it back down. Okay. She described you as quietly devastating. I think that was meant as a compliment. I genuinely cannot tell if this morning is going well or not. The eggs are bad, but the conversation is interesting. She smiled the gap-toothed smile that had become a less gapped smile in the last 2 years. The smile that was half her mother and half something entirely her own. Are you going to be okay Monday? Yes. Promise? Lilybug. I built this company from a 2-room office with second-hand furniture and a business plan I wrote at your mother's kitchen table 6 months before she got sick. I have been okay through significantly harder things than a Monday morning meeting. She looked at him steadily. Okay, she said, but I'm still going to be thinking about it. I know, thank you. He refilled his coffee. She picked up her book. The Sunday settled around them, ordinary and solid and good. The kind of morning that reminded him, when he bothered to pay attention to it, why any of the rest of it was worth doing. Monday came with fog.
San Francisco fog in the morning was its own particular thing, not dark.
Not threatening, just a softening of edges. The city muted and close and internal. Caleb drove in himself, arrived at the Walker Technologies building at 7:45, and found Marcus already there with 2 cups of coffee and a folder of documents laid precisely on the conference room table. They spent 45 minutes reviewing the material together. Not strategy in the combative sense. Neither of them was preparing to win an argument. They were preparing to have an honest conversation, which required its own kind of precision, knowing the facts, knowing the clause language, knowing what they needed to hear from the other side in order to make a decision that they could stand behind completely. At 8:55, reception called up. Richard Ashford had arrived. He came alone. Caleb had half expected a team general counsel, a communications person, possibly a mediator, if Richard had decided to make this more formal than it needed to be. But when the elevator opened, it was just Richard. Gray suit, no visible watch. He'd left the theater of the Friday night gala somewhere behind him and arrived as a man, which Caleb noted and appreciated. They shook hands in the hallway. "Thank you for the meeting. Sit down, coffee, please." They went into the conference room. Marcus poured. Richard sat across from Caleb and placed both hands flat on the table, an open gesture, deliberate, the body language of a man who had decided that the most useful thing he could bring into this room was transparency. Caleb looked at him. "I'm going to say something before we get into anything else, and I want you to hear it as a statement, not a strategy." Richard nodded. "What happened Friday matters to me professionally. You understand why Section 14C exists, because I believe the way an organization behaves at the level of individual judgment is the most accurate predictor of how a partnership will function over time. That clause is not punitive, it's diagnostic. And the review I've initiated is a real review. It will take the time it takes, and the outcome will be based on what the review finds. You understand all of that, I do, but I want to be clear about something else. I didn't invoke 14C because I was humiliated. I've been humiliated before. People have made assumptions about me my entire career based on how I present, and I have never once involved legal documentation because someone was rude to me." He paused. "I invoked it because what I saw on Friday told me something about the internal culture of a partner organization that I needed to examine before we went further. That's the distinction. Can you work with that distinction?" "Yes." Richard's voice was quiet and direct, and I want to respond to that directly. Not argue against the review. I'm not here to argue against the review. I'm here because I believe the review will be more useful if I'm honest with you, rather than if I manage the optics of it. Caleb waited. "My wife's behavior on Friday was not an anomaly, in the sense of being something she has never done before. It was an anomaly in the sense of being done publicly, in a high-stakes environment, in a way that had immediate consequences. But the tendency that drove it. The judgment by appearance, the assumption that she could determine someone's standing without knowing anything real about them." Richard stopped. His hands were still flat on the table. "That's not new. I've seen versions of it for years, in smaller rooms, in lower-stakes situations, and I made a choice, a long series of choices, to address it privately and insufficiently. And those choices contributed to Friday. That's my accountability in this." The room was quiet. Marcus, to Caleb's right, made no movement. Caleb looked at Richard for a long moment. "That's a harder thing to say than I expected you to say. It's the accurate thing. I decided to lead with accurate rather than strategic. I can see that." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "Here's what I want to know. Not about Friday. About the structure of this partnership as it relates to decision-making culture. Because what I'm reviewing isn't one incident. I'm reviewing whether this incident is the visible piece of a larger pattern. So talk to me about your board. Talk to me about how decisions get made inside Ashford Capital when the stakes are high and the pressure is on." And Richard talked. He talked for 40 minutes with the specificity of a man who had thought carefully about what he was going to say and had decided that incomplete honesty was worse than no conversation at all. He talked about the board composition, about the two members who had functioned as effective checks on each other for years, and about the one who hadn't. He talked about the company culture around hierarchy, the places where deference to seniority had calcified into something less healthy. He talked about the Thursday incident, the previous November, where a junior analyst had flagged a problem in a deal structure 3 weeks before closing and had been talked out of escalating it by someone senior, and the problem had surfaced anyway, 6 months post-close, and had cost real money and real relationships. "Why didn't the analyst escalate?" Caleb asked. "Because the culture told her it wasn't her place. And when you found out, I was angry. I changed the protocol. But I didn't look at the culture that produced the choice. I treated it like a procedural failure when it was a values failure. I fixed the procedure and left the values alone." He paused. "I'm aware that's insufficient. It is. But the fact that you know it is," Caleb glanced at Marcus briefly, "that's also information." Richard looked at him. I'm not sure how to read that. It means the conversation isn't over yet. They broke at 10:15 for 30 minutes. Richard made a phone call in the hallway. Caleb went to his office, stood at the window with his coffee, and thought. Marcus appeared in the doorway. Well, he's telling the truth. The whole truth? He's telling the truth as he understands it, which is the most you can ask for from anyone. Caleb turned from the window. He hasn't minimized the accountability. He hasn't tried to separate himself from the incident by throwing Victoria under the bus cleanly. He's keeping the whole thing in front of him. That's a quality I can work with. The partnership, though, as it stands. The partnership as it stands isn't what I want, which is what I'm going to tell him when we go back in. Marcus looked at him carefully. You have terms. I have requirements. There's a difference. What kind of requirements? The kind that tell me whether this is a man who's willing to actually change something or just willing to apologize for something. Caleb picked up his coffee. We'll find out. When they reconvened, Caleb placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. I want to talk about what a restructured partnership looks like. Not rescinded, restructured. Because I think there's something worth building here. But I think the architecture needs to change. Richard looked at the paper without picking it up. Tell me. 3 things. First, board composition on the Joint Oversight Committee needs to include an independent ethics officer, not advisory. Voting capacity on decisions that trigger the conduct standards of our agreement. Second, the junior analyst protocol you described. I want that fixed at the values level, not the procedure level. I want a formal mechanism protected, anonymous if needed for anyone on the combined team to escalate a concern without career consequence. That mechanism gets built into the partnership charter. Third, Caleb paused. I want a direct conversation with Victoria Ashford. Richard's expression shifted, not dramatically. But the muscles around his eyes changed in the way that indicated something had landed, that he hadn't been prepared for. With Victoria, yes. Can I ask why? Because the culture I'm examining doesn't stop at the boardroom. And because the way this gets resolved matters as much as the fact that it gets resolved. A review that ends with a signed document but leaves the actual human situation unaddressed, that's not a real resolution. That's paperwork. Caleb met his eyes. I'm not asking to confront her. I'm not asking for a public apology. I'm asking for a real conversation. The kind that is harder to have than signing a document. Richard was still. She won't find that easy, I know. He stopped. Started differently. Victoria has spent a long time building a version of herself that doesn't leave much room for the kind of conversation you're describing. It's not malice. It's armor. It was armor when I met her and I didn't. I thought it would change. Over time. I thought success and security would soften it. A pause. It didn't. I'm not asking her to take the armor off. I'm asking her to have a conversation. Those aren't the same thing. What do you want to say to her? Caleb looked at the table for a moment. Then back up. I want her to understand what she saw when she looked at me. What assumption she made and what it cost. Not so she feels bad about it. So she understands it. Because people who have that understanding tend to make different decisions going forward, and decisions are what we're in the business of making. He was quiet. And because I think she's a person who has never in her adult life had someone say those things to her directly and honestly, and I think that matters. For reasons that have nothing to do with the partnership. Richard was quiet for a long time. I can't promise she'll agree to it. I know, if she doesn't, the review proceeds as it would have anyway. I'm not making it a condition of the partnership. I'm making it a request. Richard picked up the paper from the table. Read it. Set it back down, the ethics officer. I have someone in mind. Dr. Constance Yeo. She was the compliance chair at Meridian for 6 years. Completely independent, no financial ties to either organization. I know Constance. She's excellent. The analyst protocol, I want my head of operations on that with your team. Full build, not a patch. Agreed. And the conversation with Victoria. Richard looked at him. I'll talk to her tonight. I can't promise the outcome. But I'll ask her, and I'll tell her truthfully, not as strategy that it matters. That's all I'm asking. Richard extended his hand across the table. Caleb shook it. The review is still in process, Caleb said. This conversation is part of that process. We're not done. I understand. But this is a good morning. Richard almost smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of a man who had spent a difficult weekend and a more difficult morning, who was carrying something he hadn't fully put down yet, but who could see, possibly, for the first time since Friday, that the thing he needed to hold on to was still there. "It is," Richard said. "It's a good morning." Richard left at 11:30. Caleb walked him to the elevator, shook his hand again in the lobby, and watched Tynut the car pull away from the building's entrance before he went back upstairs. He sat at his desk for 10 minutes, without opening anything, which was unusual for him. Marcus appeared in the doorway, recognized the quality of the quiet, and waited. "Pull the documentation on the joint committee structure," Caleb said finally. "I want to start drafting the amendment language this afternoon. Ahead of the review conclusion, we know enough to start building. If the review changes the direction, we adjust. But I don't want to spend another week on pause when there's work to do." Marcus nodded. "Turn to go, Marcus." He stopped. "He told me about a junior analyst. Someone who saw a problem and didn't escalate it because the culture told her not to. I heard. Find out who she is." Marcus turned back. "Why?" "Because I want to know if she's still at Ashford Capital. And if she is, I want her name as a potential hire for the combined team." He looked up. "Someone who can see a problem and who's been penalized for seeing it. That's not a liability. That's exactly the kind of person I want working on this." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "You're already 2 steps ahead. I'm trying to be 1 step honest. The 2 steps ahead part just comes with it." The afternoon passed in the particular rhythm of real work phone calls, documents, conversations with the legal team about amendment language, a check-in with Rosa Delgado about the prototype timeline. Caleb ate lunch at his desk, the same salted turkey sandwich from the deli 2 blocks east that he'd been eating since the building had been a different address, and the sandwich had cost 40 cents less. At 3 o'clock, his personal phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go, he answered. "Mr. Walker," a woman's voice. Careful, composed in the way that indicated effort behind the composure. "This is Victoria Ashford." He was quiet for a beat. "Mrs. Ashford, I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time." "You haven't." A pause. "Richard spoke to me last night, and again this morning, about the conversation you had." Another pause. "About your request." "Yes. I want to say before anything else, I want to say that I understand that a phone call is not equivalent to what you asked for. And I'm not calling instead of the meeting you proposed. I'm calling because—" She stopped. He could hear her composing something. Not rehearsing, composing. There was a difference. "I'm calling because I want to say something that I've found difficult to say. And I thought if I waited until a meeting, I'd spend the time between now and then finding reasons not to say it." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening. I don't know you." Her voice was level but not cold. "We've never met before Friday. And on Friday I made assumptions about you, before you'd said more than 3 words. And I acted on those assumptions in a way that was a pause. Cruel. That's the correct word. I've been trying to find a more moderate word for 2 days, and I keep coming back to that one. What I did was cruel." He said nothing. He let the silence stand, not as pressure but as space. "I could tell you that I've never done something like that before. But that wouldn't be completely honest. I've done smaller versions of it, more privately, in rooms where I was more confident the consequences would stay contained. And the fact that it took visible consequences to bring me to this phone call is not something I'm proud of. I appreciate you saying that. I'm not saying it to manage the situation. I want to be clear about that. Richard asked me to have a conversation with you, and my first instinct, I'll be honest, my first instinct was to find a way to do the minimum version of that, to meet the request technically without meeting it. Actually, that's what I do. I've been doing it for 20 years in situations like this." A pause. "I didn't call to do the minimum version." Caleb was still. "What are you calling to do?" "What are you calling to do?" "I'm calling to tell you that the thing you said when you walked away, I've been thinking about it since Friday night. I've been turning it over and over. You just showed me everything I needed to know, and I've been trying to understand whether that was true, what I showed you." Whether it was everything or just one thing. She paused. I think it was more than one thing. I think you saw. I think you saw something that I've been very careful about who gets to see. And the fact that you saw it, and didn't you? Didn't use it the way I expected someone would. You didn't perform anger. You didn't make a scene. You walked away knowing something, and that scared me, more than any reaction I was prepared for. What did you think I knew? A long pause, that I was afraid. Her voice was still level, still controlled, but beneath it, something had shifted, the faintest change of pressure, like a door that's been opened a crack and lets in a new temperature. I don't present as someone who's afraid. I've spent a lot of years making sure I don't. But the way I behaved at that table, the certainty I had, before I knew anything, that I was more important than you, that's not confidence. That's something else. And I think you knew that. Caleb looked out his office window. The fog had burned off during the morning. The sky was clear now, the particular clean blue of a San Francisco afternoon. The kind that made you forget the fog had ever been there. I didn't know all of that on Friday, he said. I knew what I could see, which was someone acting from a place of certainty that they didn't actually have the information to justify. That's a pattern I've seen before. The interpretation you just gave it the fear underneath it. I didn't have that until just now. Silence. I'll come to the meeting, she said. Whenever you want to schedule it. I'll come, and I'll have the actual conversation you asked for, not the managed version. I know you will. You don't know that. You just told me you barely know anything about me. I know it because of this phone call, which you didn't have to make, which was harder than waiting for a meeting and easier to avoid. And you made it anyway. He paused. That tells me something. Quiet. Then, faintly, the kind of sound that happens when someone exhales after they've been holding their breath without knowing it. I'll have my assistant contact Marcus to schedule. That works, Mr. Walker. Yes, I'm sorry for what I did. Not as part of any process. Not in exchange for the review outcome, or the partnership, or anything else. Just a pause. I'm sorry. I treated you like you were less than you were. And you handled it better than I deserved. Caleb held the phone for a moment. I appreciate that, Mrs. Ashford. I'll see you at the meeting. He set the phone down, sat with it for a minute, then picked it back up and called Marcus. Push the amendment review to tomorrow morning. I have something I want to add to the terms. What terms? The partnership charter, the values section. I want to add language about the standard of conduct expected from all persons affiliated with the partnership. Not legal language, real language. The kind that says what we actually mean. Marcus was quiet for a second. What happened? Someone showed me they were capable of change, which means the architecture of what we're building should account for that. Caleb. Yeah, did she call you? She called me. A pause. Well, Marcus said, and then I'll push the meeting. The news broke on Wednesday. Not dramatically, there was no press conference, no formal announcement, no carefully orchestrated leak. But in the world where these things circulated, financial press, tech industry newsletters, the particular network of people whose professional lives were arranged around knowing what was happening before it became official, the story moved fast. Walker Technologies had suspended the $3.2 billion partnership. A review was in progress. The clause that had been invoked was unusual, a personal conduct standard embedded in the partnership agreement, the kind of language that corporate lawyers described, off the record, as unusually specific and almost philosophical. The why circulated faster than the what. By Thursday, 3 different financial journalists had the outlines of the gala story. By Thursday afternoon, one of them had published a piece carefully worded, based on unnamed sources, no photographs, that described a significant interpersonal incident at the Grand Pacific event involving a principal partner and a member of an affiliated family. The piece was calibrated to say everything without confirming anything. It didn't need to confirm anything. Everyone in the relevant universe already knew. Thomas Brightwell read the piece at his desk on Thursday morning and sent it to James Cho with the message, called it. James responded. We all called it. The question is where it lands. Thomas typed back on Walker. It always lands on whoever's cleanest. Inside Ashford Capital, the piece landed differently. 3 board members called Richard on Thursday before noon. 2 of them were supportive. in the cautious way that board members support a CEO when they're watching to see which way the situation resolves. One of them was not supportive in a way that was also cautious, the particular brand of not supportive that involved a lot of procedural language and phrases like governance, concerns, and fiduciary visibility. That board member's name was Elliot Haas. He was 67, had been on the Ashford Capital Board for 11 years, and operated with the settled confidence of a man who had been in enough rooms for long enough to believe that the rooms were built around him rather than the other way. He arrived at Richard's office at 2 in the afternoon on Thursday without an appointment, which was itself a statement. Richard's assistant, Laura, looked at her calendar, and then at Elliot, and then at her calendar again. "Mr. Haas, I don't see you on. Is he in? He has calls until 3. Tell him I'm here." She picked up the phone. Caleb's name was on her screen from the 11 a.m. check-in that had just ended. She looked at it for half a second before calling Richard's extension. Richard came out of his office himself. "Elliot, we need to talk. I have calls until cancel them." The two men looked at each other. Laura became very interested in her computer screen. Richard held the door open, and Elliot walked in. "This is a governance crisis," Elliot said. He was sitting barely, the posture of a man who had sat down in order to appear composed but who was too agitated to fully inhabit the posture. "The press is running a story. The clause Walker invoked is public record. The financial journalists are connecting dots, and what they're finding is that our partner's friendship, the centerpiece of this firm's strategy for the next 5 years, is suspended because of a personal conduct incident. That is a governance crisis. The review is in process," Richard said. "We're in active conversation with Walker Technologies. The situation is being handled." Handled. "Richard, the headline is that your wife poured wine on the majority owner of our primary partner. That's not a situation that gets handled. That's a situation that requires immediate, visible, decisive action." "What kind of action are you recommending?" "A public statement. Clear separation of personal conduct from organizational conduct. Formal assurance to our stakeholders that the partnership is intact. The partnership is under review. I'm not going to issue a statement calling it intact when it's under review. Then issue a statement that addresses the incident directly. Name what happened. Name the person responsible." Richard looked at him. "Name the person responsible. Victoria." "Richard, I'm not being callous, I'm being strategic. The firm's reputation is the asset here. The way to protect the asset is to clearly delineate between institutional conduct and individual conduct. You do that by being unambiguous about where the line is. You want me to publicly distance myself from my wife. I want you to publicly protect what we've spent 30 years building." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Elliot, I've been at Ashford Capital since we were 14 people in a building that smelled like carpet cleaner. You were there when we made our first major deal, and you were there when we almost lost everything in 2008, and I've valued your perspective at every point in between." He leaned forward. "But I'm going to tell you what I've come to understand in the last 5 days. The problem this firm has is not Victoria. The problem this firm has is exactly what you're proposing right now." Elliot blinked. "What I'm proposing is sound crisis management. You're proposing that we manage the appearance of the problem instead of addressing the problem. You're proposing that we find someone to point at publicly, so the firm looks decisive, while the actual culture that produced this situation stays exactly as it is." Richard held his gaze. "Caleb Walker saw something on Friday night. He didn't see my wife. He saw a culture, a way of making decisions, a set of values or the absence of them. And if our response to being seen is to perform accountability without doing the work of actual accountability, then we deserve whatever he decides in that review." "Richard, I'm not going to publicly throw my wife under a bus so that our board doesn't have to look at itself." Elliot's jaw tightened. The board did nothing wrong. The board created the environment that told everyone in this organization that appearance was the measure of value, that the right contacts and the right address and the right presentation were what determined whether you mattered. He paused. "We did that, all of us, in 100 small decisions over many years. And on Friday, one of those decisions became visible in a way we couldn't ignore. That's not Victoria's fault alone. And pretending it is, to protect the institution, is exactly the kind of decision that makes me understand why Caleb Walker put that clause in the agreement to begin with. The room was very quiet. Elliot looked at him for a long moment. You've changed your position. I've clarified my position. There's a difference. The board will want a response to this week's press. The board will get a response. It won't be the response you're recommending. Richard stood. I have calls to reschedule. Thank you for coming in, Elliot. Elliot stood slowly. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. The review if it goes against us. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. With honesty, not optics, Richard looked at him evenly. That's the new standard. Elliot left. Richard sat back down at his desk and looked at the ceiling for 30 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called Caleb. I want to tell you about a conversation I just had. Caleb listened. He listened to all of it, the board member, the pressure, the recommended response, and Richard's refusal of it. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality he'd developed over years, because he'd learned that the most accurate picture of a person was usually in the parts. They didn't plan to say the asides, the hesitations, the moments where the managed version slipped and something realer came through. When Richard finished, Caleb said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the review is ongoing, and because the most useful thing I can give you is an accurate picture of what's happening inside this organization. Even the parts that make us look bad. Especially those parts." Caleb was quiet. "Elliot Haas," he said. "He's been on your board 11 years. Yes. And his recommended response to a values problem was to perform accountability without doing the work of it. Yes, that's useful information. I thought it might be." Richard. Caleb paused, choosing the words carefully. "I want to tell you something about why I started this company. Not the pitch version, the actual reason. All right? My wife was sick for 2 years before she died. And in those 2 years, I watched the way the healthcare system responded to people based on what they looked like, what they were wearing, what zip code they came from, whether they had the right insurance, the right connections, the right presentation. I watched people get less attention, less urgency, less dignity, not because they needed less care, but because someone in a position of authority looked at them and made a decision about their value before they knew anything real about them." He paused. "I built this company because I wanted to make medical technology that didn't require you to look a certain way to deserve access to it. And every partnership I enter, every board I sit across from, every deal I negotiate, I'm asking one question always. Is this an organization that understands what it's building? Or is it an organization that just wants to profit from something I built?" Richard was silent. Friday answered part of that question. This phone call is answering more of it. Caleb paused. "The review concludes Friday. I'll have the formal outcome to your legal team by end of business. And the partnership? I'll let the document speak. But Richard, I want you to start thinking about Elliot Haas and what his continued presence on the board means for the culture you said you want to build. That's not a condition. That's a question I think you already know the answer to." The line was quiet. "I know the answer," Richard said. "I thought you did." Caleb ended the call. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he opened the document he'd been drafting since Tuesday, the amendment language, the restructured terms, the values section that Marcus had asked about, and he began to write. Not as strategy, not as protection, as belief. The belief that the thing worth building was always the thing that outlasted the deal. The organization that could look at itself honestly. The culture that chose accountability over appearance, even when appearance was easier. The thing his wife had believed in before she got sick. The thing Lily was growing up, watching him try to build. He wrote for an hour, without stopping. Outside the window, the city was fully clear now, the fog completely gone. The bay catching the afternoon light in long flat pieces, the bridge visible all the way to the far tower. San Francisco in the afternoon, when the weather broke, looked like it was lit from inside. He finished the draft, saved it, picked up his phone and sent a text to Marcus, ready for review. "Let's meet at 4. Then he set the phone down, looked out the window one more time, and thought about a 2-room office near the bay and a deli sandwich and a business plan, written at a kitchen table. about how far you could get if you kept your head down and did honest work, about how little it required in the end to understand who a person really was, about a glass of wine and everything it had shown him. The review concluded on Friday at 4:47 p.m. Marcus hand-delivered the formal documentation to Ashford Capital's legal team at 5:15, which was 15 minutes before the end of business and 3 hours before the financial press would have given up, waiting and run whatever they had without confirmation. The timing was deliberate, not to create drama. Caleb had no interest in drama, but because he'd learned over 15 years that the window between a decision being made and a decision being announced was where the most damage happened. People filled silence with speculation. Speculation hardened into narrative. Narrative, once it hardened, was difficult to correct even with facts. So the document went out at 5:15, and the document said what Caleb had written in the values section, in the language he'd spent Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday finding that Walker Technologies had concluded its review under Section 14C and had determined that the conditions for partnership continuations existed, subject to the restructured terms outlined in Amendment 7. That the restructured terms included an independent ethics officer with voting capacity, a protected escalation mechanism for all personnel affiliated with the partnership, and a revised conduct standard that applied to all principals and their immediate families. It also said, in the third paragraph, in plain language that no corporate lawyer had written, because Caleb had written it himself, that the partnership was being rebuilt on the understanding that the measure of an organization was not its best case performance but its response to its own failures, and that Walker Technologies was committed to this partnership because of the response it had witnessed in the week following the Grand Pacific event. Not in spite of what had happened, because of what came after. Richard read the document in his office at 5:22 p.m. He read it twice. Then he called his assistant Laura and told her he'd be leaving for the evening and to hold all calls until Monday. Then he sat alone at his desk for several minutes, without doing anything, without checking his phone, without opening his email, without reaching for the next task. He just sat with the weight of the week, all of it. The Friday gala, and the wine, and the phone call from Daniel Foss, and the conversation with Victoria in the elevator, and the Monday morning meeting and Elliot, and the phone call where Caleb had talked about his wife and the two-room office, and the deli sandwich. He sat with all of it and let it land. It landed heavily. Not with grief, exactly. With something more complicated. The feeling of a man who had looked at his own life with a clarity he'd been avoiding for some time and had found the picture different from what he'd preferred to believe. He picked up his phone, not to call anyone, to look at the family photo on his lock screen, the one from a trip to Italy 3 years ago, Victoria in sunlight, both of them, in the middle of somewhere beautiful. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went home. Victoria was in the kitchen when he arrived. She was making tea, which was what she did when she was working through something. Not cooking, which she found performative, but tea, which was private and habitual and required just enough activity to occupy the hands without occupying the mind. She heard the door, heard his footsteps, knew from the rhythm of them the quality of the evening he'd had. The review came out, she said without turning around. It came out, and the partnership stands, with new terms. She turned then, studied his face, no but, partnership stands. He set his jacket over the back of a chair and sat down at the kitchen counter. He restructured it, added an ethics officer, added a protected escalation mechanism, rewrote the conduct standard, a pause, and he wrote a paragraph about why the partnership was continuing, about what the response to the incident told him. She looked at him. He wrote about the response. He said the partnership was being rebuilt because of what happened after the incident, the honesty about it, the willingness to look at the culture rather than just the event. She was quiet. She turned back to the kettle, poured the water into the cup, wrapped both hands around it. The tea needed to steep. She let it. I spoke with him again today, she said. Briefly, to confirm the meeting next week. I know. Marcus mentioned it. I told him I'd come. I know that too. She turned back around, leaning against the counter with the cup in her hands, and looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she was saying something real rather than something managed. He'd learned to recognize it over 22 years. It was rarer than it should have been, and he'd never told her that directly, which was its own accountability. I'm afraid of the meeting. I know. Not of him. He's not threatening. I know that now. But of having to say things in a room, to a person, without the ability to revise them afterward, without the buffer of the phone. I said things on the phone call that I've said in my head for years, Ned's never said out loud. In a room, with the full conversation, I won't have. She stopped. I won't have the controlled version available. No, Richard said. You won't. You think I should go anyway. I think you've already decided to go anyway. I think you're telling me you're afraid, because you want me to know the cost of what you're doing. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a perceptive read. I've had 22 years. Something shifted in her expression, not softening into warmth. Exactly. But opening into something that looked less like the composed face she wore to the world, and more like the face of someone who was genuinely present in a kitchen on a Friday evening with the person they'd built everything beside. I owe you an apology too, she said, Victoria. Not for Friday. Or not only for Friday. For the longer version of it. She held the cup steadily, both hands around it. I've known for a long time that there was something in me that operated the way it operated on Friday, that I made those assessments, that I used position and appearance as a measure of people. I knew it, and I made it your job to manage the consequences of it without ever addressing the thing itself. And you managed it for years because she paused. That was the arrangement, and I let that be the arrangement. He looked at her. We both let it be the arrangement. I'm not asking you to share responsibility for my choices. I'm not sharing responsibility. I'm telling you that a marriage is an ecosystem. What grows in it grows in both directions. And I didn't say the true thing, the direct thing, because I didn't want to have the fight, and the thing I wanted to avoid was less important than the thing I was protecting by avoiding it. He held her eyes. I'm sorry for that part. That's mine. She put the cup down on the counter and crossed her arms, which was not a defensive gesture, so much as a steadying one, the way she held herself together when something real had landed. Elliot Haas called me today. Richard's expression changed. Why did he call you? To tell me that he thought the situation was being mishandled, that the firm was absorbing damage it didn't need to absorb, that there were steps that could be taken to. She paused. Clarify the record regarding individual versus institutional responsibility. That's a direct quote. Richard was very still. He called you. He thought I might be more receptive than you were. He was wrong. Her voice was even. I told him that I appreciated his perspective and that I had nothing to add to the conversation. And then I ended the call, a long beat of silence. You didn't tell me. I'm telling you now. Why did you wait? Because I needed to decide first what I thought about it, before I told you. Because if I'd called you the moment he hung up, I would have told you what I was feeling, rather than what I'd concluded. And the conclusion is more useful. She looked at him steadily. Elliot is telling you that the easy path is to make me the clear villain. And I know that. And I'm telling you clearly that I don't want that path. Not because it's bad for me, because it's wrong. Richard looked at his wife. He had married a complicated woman. He had known that when he married her, and he had sometimes wished she were simpler. And more often was grateful that she wasn't. She had a quality, this quality, right here, in the kitchen, on a Friday evening of eventually arriving at the honest version of herself. It took longer than it should have, and it cost more than it needed to, but she arrived. Elliot needs to leave the board, Richard said. I know, it's not about the phone call, it's what the phone call shows. About how he thinks, about what he prioritizes. I know that too. Will you? He stopped. Will I what? When it happens. There will be a version of events where it looks like Elliot is leaving. Because of you. Because the firm is reorganizing around the incident. People will connect those dots. Let them. Victoria. Richard. She picked up her tea. I spent 20 years building a version of myself that couldn't be touched. And look where that ended up. Let them connect the dots. The dots lead to the truth, and the truth is that the firm needed to change some things and is changing them. If I'm part of why, if what I did is part of what made it visible, then that's the accurate story. She looked at him. I'm done managing the story. He crossed to her. He put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her with the particular look of a man who had known someone for 22 years and was seeing something in them that was new. Not new because it hadn't been there before. New because it was finally visible. I'm proud of you, he said. She looked slightly startled. For what? For the phone call you made to Walker. For this conversation. For what you said to Elliot. He held her eyes. For arriving. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her tea. Don't make it sentimental, she said. But she said it without edge, and he heard, underneath it, the thing she was not quite saying yet. The gratitude, the relief. The feeling of a woman who had put down something she'd been carrying for a very long time and found that her arms still worked. Elliot Haas resigned from the board the following Tuesday. The official statement described it as a mutual decision, reflecting a natural transition after a decade of service. The statement was precise and professional, and said nothing that wasn't technically true, which was a courtesy Richard extended. Because Elliot had been present for a significant chapter of the firm's history, and courtesy was not the same as dishonesty. Two people asked Richard directly whether the departure was connected to the Walker situation. To the first, a journalist he trusted enough to answer, he said, "The board is evolving to reflect where this firm is going, not where it's been." To the second, Thomas Brightwell, who asked over coffee with the directness of a man who had no particular interest in the answer, being anything other than accurate, he said, "Elliot and I had different views on how to address a significant situation. The firm went one way, Elliot went another. That's the honest version." Thomas Brightwell nodded and said, "Walker's restructured terms. You read the amendment. I read everything. The ethics officer language is interesting. The escalation mechanism is interesting. But the values paragraph," Thomas paused. "That paragraph is unusual. I've reviewed a lot of partnership documentation, and I have never seen language like that in a binding agreement. It's almost like a statement of belief. Yes, it is a statement of belief." Thomas looked at him. "Walker wrote it himself." "He did. How do you know?" "Because I've read enough legal documents to know what a lawyer writes and what a person writes. And that paragraph is a person writing." Richard paused. "A specific person with a specific history." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You know his wife died. I know. Of something that might have been caught earlier. With different access. Yes. And he built a company to address that. Yes." Thomas set his coffee cup down. He looked at it for a moment, then at Richard. "When's the signing?" 2 weeks. "The formal ceremony is private. Just the primary parties. No rooftop, no rooftop." Richard almost smiled. "Conference room. My office. Walker asked for it that way. Simpler. He prefers simpler. I'm beginning to understand why." The meeting between Caleb and Victoria happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 10 days after the gala. Marcus had offered the Walker Technologies conference room. Caleb had declined not because he wanted to put Victoria on unfamiliar territory, but because the conference room felt too formal for what the meeting was supposed to be. Too much like a proceeding. He'd suggested a coffee shop, 2 blocks from his office that he went to most mornings. Small, not trendy. The kind of place where the staff knew his order, and nobody was likely to recognize either of them. Victoria had agreed without comment. She arrived 3 minutes early. He was already there, at a corner table, the corner again. Always the corner, with 2 coffees already ordered. She sat down across from him, took the cup, and looked at him with the composed face and the careful eyes of a woman who had prepared for this, and was finding that preparation only went so far. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking." A brief silence. The coffee shop moved around them, the machine behind the counter, a couple at the window table, a man typing on a laptop in the far corner. Ordinary morning noise. Calming, in the way that ordinary things were calming, when something difficult was about to happen. "I want to start by asking you something," Caleb said. "All right, when you walked up to that table on Friday, before you'd said anything, what did you see?" She held the coffee cup. "Didn't look away, a man who didn't fit how?" in the way that in the way that I'd been trained to read rooms. The signals that tell you who someone is, the watch, the suit, the presence. The way a person moves in a room that communicates that they know they belong there. She paused. You weren't doing any of those things. And that made you think that you didn't belong. She said it plainly, without the softening she might have applied to it a week ago. That someone had made an error, that the seat at that table had been given to the wrong person. You'd never seen me before that night. No, you didn't know anything about me. No, and based on a suit and a glass of water, you decided that you knew enough. Yes. Her voice stayed steady, but he could see what it cost her, the effort of saying it, without the flinch, without the revision, without the managed version. That's exactly what I did. He nodded slowly. Can I tell you something? Please. I wasn't offended by the assumption. I want to be clear about that. I've had versions of that assumption made about me my entire career, long before I had anything that would satisfy the signals you were reading. I sat in rooms full of people who decided I didn't belong before I'd said a word, and I've learned to let it move past me. It moves past me because I know what I've built, and I know why I built it, and the opinion of a stranger at a party doesn't change either of those things. He paused. What stopped me on Friday wasn't the assumption, it was the action, the whine, the decision to make it public, to use the room as an audience. He looked at her directly. That was a choice, a deliberate one. And what I recognized in that choice was something I've spoken before, not in individuals, but in institutions, in cultures that operate by the principle that position justifies everything, that if you have enough status, enough influence, enough history in a room, you can do the thing and the thing won't have consequences. Because consequences require someone to have the standing to impose them. Victoria was still. You thought I had standing. I knew I had standing. That's different from thinking. He held her gaze. I'm not telling you this to be cruel. I'm telling you because I think the thing underneath what happened, the assumption that action without consequence was available to you, is the thing worth examining. Not the action, the assumption. She looked at her coffee cup. I've had access to that assumption for a long time, she said quietly. It accumulated, slowly. It wasn't a decision I made once. It was 100 small moments where the consequence didn't come, and the boundary moved a little further, and nobody said. She stopped. Nobody said the true thing. Richard, my friends. The people in the rooms I moved in. Everyone managed it instead of addressing it. A pause. Including me. I managed it in myself. Found ways to describe the behavior that made it something other than what it was. Until Friday. When the consequence arrived in the form of a man who sat still and wiped his face with a handkerchief and said 8 words that I haven't been able to stop hearing since. He was quiet. What did those words mean to you when I said them? She looked up. At the time, they frightened me because I didn't know what you knew. I didn't know if you understood what you had authority over. I assumed they were a threat. A warning that you were about to, that there would be some kind of retaliation. And now I understand that they weren't a threat. They were just true. You had seen something real. In me, in the room, in the way the room responded. She paused. In the way nobody said anything. Nobody said anything, Caleb agreed. That's its own kind of data point. Yes, it is. He looked at her. Mrs. Ashford. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer doesn't affect the partnership or the review outcome or anything professional. It's a personal question. She nodded. The person you described on the phone. The one who built a version of herself that operated by those rules. The one who used position as protection. He paused. How long has she been tired? The question landed in a way she hadn't prepared for. She looked at him. For a moment her face was completely unguarded, not by choice, not as strategy, but because the question had arrived at a speed that bypassed the defense. She felt it, the sudden absence of the managed version, the exposure of something she had not planned to show in this room or possibly in any room. She looked down at the table. A long time, she said. Her voice was different. Not broken, she was not a woman who broke easily, and probably would never be. But quieter, more interior. The voice of someone speaking from a place they didn't often speak from. I was 26 when I married Richard. and I understood correctly that the world we were entering operated by specific rules, that there was a language to it, an architecture of status and presentation that determined access, and I was good at learning that language, faster than most. And the faster I learned it, the more the room responded. She paused, and somewhere in that the language became it. Stopped being something I was using and became something I was. And you couldn't tell the difference anymore. I stopped looking for the difference. It was easier not to look. He was quiet for a moment. My wife, he said, before got sick. She used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was become so fluent in a false language that they forgot they'd ever spoken anything else. He paused. She was a linguist, before the illness. She thought about language, the way other people thought about physics, as something with laws, with weight, with real consequence. Victoria looked at him. She sounds remarkable. She was. She was also the most direct person I've ever known. She would have said something to you on Friday that I didn't. She would have said it clearly and without malice, and in a way that would have been harder to absorb than anything I did. He almost smiled. She was better at the direct thing than I am. I opt for silence. She opted for precision. What would she have said? He looked at the table for a moment. She would have said, "You're performing. You've been performing so long you think it's real. But it's not real, and you know it, and that's why you're so angry all the time." He looked up. She always went straight for the thing underneath. The thing. Victoria absorbed this. She was right, she said. And then after a pause about all of it, "I know. I'm sorry for your loss." The words were simple, unadorned. The way real condolency sounded when they weren't performing condolence. "I'm genuinely sorry, thank you." They sat for a moment in the quiet that had settled between them, not uncomfortable, not empty, but the particular quiet of two people who had arrived somewhere they hadn't expected to arrive when they'd walked in the door. "I'm going to work on it," she said. "The thing underneath. I've been talking to someone, a therapist. I've been 3 times since Friday, which is more than the previous 20 years combined." A pause. "I'm telling you that because you asked a personal question, and I'm choosing to answer personally, not because it has anything to do with the partnership. I know, and I'm glad it's uncomfortable. Most true things are." She almost smiled. Not quite, but the edges of it were there. "Mr. Walker, Caleb." She looked at him, Caleb. She held the cup in both hands. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, I'll accept it. Go ahead. Is what you're doing? This meeting, the review, the restructured terms, is any part of it about making us pay? About the consequence reaching the right proportion? I'm asking because I want to understand what you're actually building, whether it's justice or something else." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "It's not about consequence. I don't have any interest in punishment. Never did. The clause existed because I needed a mechanism to examine a culture before committing to it, not to punish it when it failed, but to understand it, to decide whether the failure was the culture or an event in the culture." He paused. "What I found when I examined it was a culture that had real problems, and people inside it who, when the problems became visible, chose honesty over strategy. That's not a culture I want to punish. That's a culture I want to build something with." She was quiet. "And me specifically?" "What I did. What you did told me what I needed to know to make a decision. And then what you did afterward. The phone call, this conversation told me something else. Something that matters more, in the long run, than the thing that happened at the table." He held her eyes steadily. "People are not their worst moments. I've never believed that. My worst moment happened in a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning when I was 34 years old and completely alone, and I behaved in a way that I'm not going to describe in a coffee shop. But it was the worst version of me, and the rest of my life has been partly about making sure that version doesn't win." He paused. "You get to do that too. That's not forgiveness. I'm not in the business of dispensing forgiveness. That's not what this is. It's just acknowledgement that the thing you showed me on Friday is not the only thing you are." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. "Not managed. Not performed. Just 2 words." With the full weight of a woman who had spent 10 days arriving at a place she'd never been before, and had finally gotten there. They talked for another 40 minutes about his company, about what the medical technology actually did, and who it was designed to reach, and why the access problem was the problem he'd chosen. She asked questions that were specific, not polite. The questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than appear to understand, which was a different quality, and he recognized it. She told him about a healthcare initiative she'd been attached to for 3 years, a nonprofit that provided mobile screenings in under-resourced communities. She'd funded it at the recommendation of a publicist, originally, as part of a profile rebuild after a controversy he hadn't known about. But she'd kept funding it after the profile piece was published and kept engaging with it. And last year had gone herself to a screening event in East Oakland and had spent 4 hours talking to people she would never have spoken to in any other context. And, he said, and it was the most useful 4 hours I'd spent in years. And I didn't know what to do with that. What do you mean? I mean, I went home and I thought about it for a week. About what it felt like to be in a room where I was completely unknown, where no one knew who Richard was or what the firm did or where I lived, where I was just a woman, helping. She paused, and I thought about the fact that I'd spent 20 years doing the exact opposite, building a room where everyone knew exactly who I was and what that meant. And I asked myself which of those two rooms felt more real. A pause. I didn't like the answer. Caleb looked at her. Have you been back to the program? Twice since then. I'm going again next month. What do you do there? I help run the intake process. I talk to people. I ask them questions, and I listen to the answers. She looked at him. It's the same skill I've been using in boardrooms for 20 years. Listening. Reading what people actually need versus what they're saying they need. I pointed it somewhere different. That's not nothing, he said. That's actually quite a lot. She looked slightly startled by that, as though she hadn't considered the possibility that he might say something like it. I thought you might. She stopped. What? I thought this meeting might be harder. In a different direction. I came prepared to be confronted, to be told clearly and specifically what the cost had been. To sit with that. The cost was real. I'm not minimizing it. I know, but you didn't. She paused. You didn't lead with it. No. Why? He looked at her. Because you already knew the cost. You've known it since Friday night. And telling you something you already know, in detail, for an extended period of time, that's not a conversation. That's a performance. And I told you I have no interest in performance. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a very unusual person, she said. I've been told. I mean that as a genuine observation. Not a compliment exactly, more of a recalibration. Of what? Of what I thought powerful people looked like. He looked at her. What did you think they looked like? She almost laughed. Not quite. But the almost law was more genuine than any expression she'd worn when the meeting started. You know the answer to that. I do. But I think it's worth you saying it. A pause. I thought they looked like the room, like the signals, like everything that was visible and legible from a distance. She held his eyes. I didn't expect them to look like a man in a repaired Navy suit, drinking water at a corner table. He was quiet. My daughter picked the suit, he said. She looked at him. She told me it looked good, that the repaired part didn't show, and that if anyone was rude to me, I should remember that the way people treat you, when they think you don't matter, is the most honest thing they'll ever show you. He paused. She's 11. Victoria looked at the table, then back at him. She sounds like her father. She sounds like her mother, he said. But I'm working on it. He walked back to his office in the afternoon light with his hands in his pockets, and the particular feeling of someone who had done the harder thing and found that it was worth doing. Marcus was in the hallway when he arrived. How was it? Good. Good as in diplomatically good, or good as in actually good? Actually good. Marcus studied his face with the attention 9 years of knowing what Caleb Walker's expressions meant. She surprised you. She did. In what direction? Caleb considered. The honest direction. The direction I didn't fully expect. He moved toward his office. Pull up the intake roster for the community screening program in East Oakland. The mobile cardiac unit. Marcus stopped. Why? I want to see who runs it. Caleb. He stopped in the doorway. She funds it, he said. And she's been going in person, doing intake, a pause. I want to know if it's well-resourced. And if it isn't, I want to know what they need. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You're going to fund it. I'm going to look at it. And then I'm going to decide. Based on what? Based on whether it does what it says it does. And whether the people running it are the kind of people worth building something with.
He looked at the fox steadily.
The same standard I apply to everything. Marcus nodded slowly. I'll have the information by end of day. Thank you. Caleb went into his office, sat at his desk, opened the laptop. There were 43 unread emails, 3 calls to return. A prototype review scheduled for Thursday. The amendment signing, formal and private, in 9 days. He looked at all of it. Then he opened the draft he'd been writing in the margins of the past week. Not work, not strategy, not documentation. A letter, addressed to no one in particular, or to Lily, or to the future version of the company he was trying to build. He wrote in it, sporadically. When something happened that he thought was worth preserving, he opened it now, added a paragraph. It said, "The meeting happened. She arrived. That is the whole of it, and it is enough." He saved it, closed the laptop, and picked up the phone to call his daughter, because it was 3:15 and she'd be home from school, and he'd told her he'd call when the meeting was done. And Caleb Walker, regardless of what else was happening in his life, kept his promises to the people who were counting on him. She answered on the second ring. How'd it go? It went well. Yeah? A pause. Did she say she was sorry? She did. Was it real? He looked out the window at the afternoon city, the clear sky, the bay in the distance, the bridge, catching the light the way it did at this hour. It was real. Okay, Lily said. And he could hear in those 2 words the particular mixture of relief and satisfaction, an 11-year-old righteousness that meant she'd been waiting for exactly that answer. Okay, good. How was school? Mrs. Henley said my essay about you was very good. She gave me an A-. An A-. She said the writing was excellent, but I relied too heavily on personal admiration rather than objective evidence. That seems like a fair critique. I told her the personal admiration was the point. She gave me the A- anyway. An A- is a good grade. It's almost an A. Almost an A, which is almost perfect, Lily said. Which is basically us, he laughed. The real kind. The kind that came from somewhere genuine and surprised him with its presence. Basically us, he said. Outside, the city kept moving. The bay kept catching the light. The bridge stood where it always stood, solid and large and unconcerned with the small human dramas happening beneath it. And Caleb Walker sat at his desk, 43 emails unread, 1 amendment 9 days from signing, 1 letter saved on his laptop that no one would probably ever read, and talked to his daughter about an A- and the nature of perfection, until the afternoon began to turn toward evening. And the work, as it always did, could wait a little longer. The signing happened on a Tuesday. No rooftop, no golden lights, no 500 people performing their best version of importance at each other. Just a conference room on the 14th floor of the Ashford Capitol building, a table with 6 chairs, 2 legal teams, and 4 people who had spent the last 2 weeks deciding what kind of thing they were going to build together. Caleb arrived alone. Walked from the parking garage, took the elevator. Richard met him in the hallway, extended his hand, and said, "Thank you for being here. Let's get it done." They went in. The documentation took 40 minutes to execute signatures, initials, the particular procedural rhythm of making something official that had already been decided. The ethics officer language, the escalation mechanism, the values paragraph that Caleb had written himself, and that the lawyers had tried 3 times to soften, and that he had declined, each time, to soften. It went in exactly as he'd written it. In plain language, in the binding agreement, where it would mean something real. When the last page was signed, Richard looked across the table. I want to say something that isn't in any of the documentation. Caleb waited. I've been in business for 30 years. I've signed a significant number of agreements, and this is the first time I've sat at a table like this and felt that the document we just signed was more honest than the one it replaced. He paused. That's because of you. And I want that said directly in this room, with both teams present. Caleb looked at him. It's because of both of us, he said. The document is honest because the people at this table were willing to be honest. That's not a solo achievement. Marcus beside Caleb was quiet. Daniel Foss beside Richard was quiet. The two legal teams were quiet. The room held the particular stillness of people who understood they were present at something worth being present for. Then Caleb picked up the signed copy of the amendment, looked at the values paragraph one more time, and set it back down. "Let's go to work," he said. 3 weeks after the signing, Rosa Delgado stood in front of a room of 12 people and presented the third phase prototype results for the cardiac monitoring device. The accuracy rate had improved by 4 percentage points from the second test. The battery life had extended to 96 hours. The manufacturing cost per unit had been reduced to a number that made the device genuinely accessible to the clinics and community health programs that needed it most. Caleb sat in the back of the room and listened. He didn't take notes. He rarely took notes in presentations. He found that taking notes made him watch the paper instead of the person. And the person was where the real information lived. He watched Rosa. He watched the way she moved through the data with the intensity of someone who knew exactly why each number mattered. He watched the rest of the room respond to her, the engineers nodding.
The two Ashford Capital representative,
Who were now formally embedded in the joint development process, leaning forward when she got to the cost projection slide. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then, someone started clapping and the rest of the room joined, and Rosa looked briefly like she didn't know what to do with that before she gathered herself and said, "We're still not done," which made Caleb's smile in the particular way. He smiled when someone said something that was exactly right. Afterward, she caught him in the hallway. "Mr. Walker, do you have a minute?" "I have several." She fell into step beside him. She had a folder in her hands. She was always carrying something. Always in the middle of the next thing. "I wanted to ask you something that might be outside my lane. Ask the community screening program, the mobile cardiac unit in East Oakland. I heard we might be in conversation with them about a pilot." He looked at her. "Where did you hear that?" Marcus mentioned it. "In passing. I might have asked a follow-up question." "You might have. I want to be part of it, if there's a way. I know my primary assignment is the prototype development. But the screening program, exactly the population this device is designed for. And I think there's data to be gathered in that environment that we can't get from a lab." She looked at him directly, with the look of someone who had decided that asking clearly was better than asking carefully. "I grew up in a community like that. I know how those rooms feel. I know what people need to hear before they'll let a stranger put a sensor on their chest. And I think that knowledge I think it has research value. Real value, not soft value." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "Who told you the device was designed for that population specifically?" "You did, in the lab 3 weeks ago. You said, this is exactly why we started this company." "And I thought about that for a while." She paused. "I looked up the origin story, the interviews from the early days, the reason you built the access framework the way you built it." A pause. "I read about your wife." He was quiet. "I hope that's not." "It's not." He looked at her. "The pilot program. Talk to Marcus. Tell him I said to include you in the planning conversation. And bring the data point. You just made the argument about environmental research value. Write it up properly. And bring it to the planning meeting." She looked at him. "That's yes?" "That's yes." She almost said, "Thank you," and stopped herself. She had the quality of someone who'd learned that gratitude was best expressed through the work rather than the words. She nodded once, tightened her grip on the folder, and walked back toward the lab. He watched her go. Then he stood in the hallway for a moment, with his hands in his pockets, thinking about a 2-room office and second-hand furniture, and a business plan written at a kitchen table, about the specific quality of a person who asked for what they needed directly and backed the ask with a real argument, about how much of what got built in the world got built by people who were never in the room where the decisions were made. He was going to keep changing that. The East Oakland screening program pilot launched 6 weeks after the signing. Victoria was there. Caleb had not planned for that. He'd funded the program expansion. He'd sent Rosa as the technical lead. He'd arranged for 2 of the prototype monitoring devices to be included in the pilot on a trial basis. He had not coordinated his own attendance with Victoria's. They arrived within 10 minutes of each other. She was already at the intake table when he walked in clothes that were notably ordinary, not conspicuously casual, not performing ordinariness, just dressed for a room where work was happening. She was talking to a woman in her 60s, leaning forward slightly, listening with the particular quality of attention he'd seen once before, in a coffee shop, when she'd stopped managing the conversation and started actually having it. She looked up when he walked in, a moment of adjustment, both of them recalibrating to the unexpected shared presence. Then she nodded. He nodded back. They worked the room separately for the first hour. He talked to the program director, reviewed the device setup with Rosa, spoke with 3 of the participants who'd agreed to the monitoring trial, an older man named Gerald, who'd driven 40 minutes because his doctor was booked 3 weeks out, a young woman who was there because her mother had asked her to come, a retired postal worker named Diane who said, with complete directness, "I don't trust these things, but my granddaughter said I should try." "What would make you trust it?" Caleb asked her. Diane looked at him with the assessment of a woman who had spent a lifetime determining quickly who was worth her time. "Tell me exactly what it does, not the sales version. The real version," he told her. In plain language, without simplifying, without the pitch. What the sensor measured, how the data was transmitted, what the algorithm flagged and why. What happened after a flag, the whole chain, from the device on her chest to the clinician, who would review the result. She listened. "And if it finds something?" "Then someone calls you within 24 hours. You get a real result, not a form letter. You get connected to a clinic that has the capacity to see you within a week, not 3. And if I can't pay, the program covers the follow-up. That's what the funding is for." Diane looked at him for another moment. "You built this. My team built it. I started the company. Why?" He held her gaze. "Because someone I loved needed something like this, and it wasn't available to her. And I decided that wasn't acceptable." Diane was quiet. Then she held out her arm. "Put it on," she said. During a break mid-morning, Caleb found himself standing near the door at the same time as Victoria. "I didn't know you were coming today," she said. "I didn't know you were either. I come every month. This is the 4th time." He looked at her. "It's different in person," she said, then writing the check. "I've written checks to a lot of things. This is different." "How?" "Because I can't leave when I want to. Because the people here don't know who I am, and it doesn't matter. Because I have to be useful in the actual room, not in the organizational meeting about the room." She paused. "It's harder, in the way that real things are harder than managed things." He looked at the room, at Gerald filling out paperwork with the focused effort of someone unused to medical forms, at Rosa explaining the device to a family with 2 teenage sons who were more interested in the technology than their parents were, at Diane sitting with the monitor on her wrist, talking to the young woman beside her with the authority of someone who had made a decision and was now helping someone else make theirs. "My wife would have liked this room," he said. Victoria was quiet beside him. "Tell me about her," she said. "If you want to. You don't have to." He looked at the room for a moment. Her name was Anne. She was a linguist. She studied the way language changed over generations, the way communities held onto words as a way of holding onto identity. She was from a small town in eastern Oregon. She had the specific quality of someone who'd grown up somewhere that didn't prepare you for the world you ended up in, which she said was the best possible preparation. He paused. "She was the first person who told me to start the company. When it was still an idea I was too afraid to say out loud," she said. "The idea is real. You're just scared it won't work. Those are different problems. One of them is solvable." Victoria was still. "She was right," he said. "Both parts. She sounds like someone who said the true thing. Every time, even when it was hard to hear, especially then." He was quiet. "She got sick 18 months after Lily was born. She fought it for 2 years. And in those 2 years I watched what the system did and didn't do. What it was capable of and who it was capable of it for." He looked at the room. "This is the answer to that. Not a complete answer, but a real one." Victoria looked at him. "She would have liked this room," she said. "And I think she would have liked you. The version of you that exists now, having built this. I think she would have had a few things to say about me." Probably. But she would have meant them kindly. He looked at her. You're better at this than you think. At what? At being in a room where nobody knows who you are. You've been good at it all morning. She looked slightly startled. Then the almost smile that he'd first seen in the coffee shop. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to manage. I thought you were done managing the story. I'm done managing the important parts. The unimportant parts I reserve the right to maintain. She looked at him. A woman has to have some mystery, he laughed. Genuinely. The way he'd laughed with Lily about the eggs. From somewhere real and unguarded. She laughed too. And that was the moment, not the signing, not the coffee shop, not the phone call. That was the moment when the thing between them stopped being a resolution and became something else. Something simpler and more durable. The beginning of people who understood each other. Lily found out about the pilot program the way she found out about most things through Emily Hartley, whose mother's podcast had apparently expanded its scope to include healthcare technology startups. She asked Caleb about it at dinner. Emily's mom said you started a program in East Oakland for cardiac screening. We expanded a program that already existed. We funded the expansion. Is it working? It's been 3 weeks. The early data looks good. She poked at her dinner which he had made, which was more ambitious than eggs, which was going somewhat better than eggs, though the standard was admittedly low. Dad, yeah, is the company, are you doing what you said you were going to do? When you started it. He looked at her. What did I say I was going to do? You said you were going to build something that helped people who needed it. Not just people who could afford to need it. She said it with the precision of someone who had heard a thing said correctly and stored it exactly. Is that what you're doing? He thought about Diane. About Gerald. About Rosa Delgado standing in the lab, saying we're still not done with the conviction of someone who meant it as a promise rather than a complaint. He thought about a values paragraph in a binding agreement that said, in plain language, what he actually believed. He thought about Anne, and a 2-room office, and a business plan written at a kitchen table, and 11 years of building something in the specific direction she had pointed him. Yes, he said, that's what we're doing. Lily considered this with the gravity it deserved. Okay, she said, good. She picked up her fork, took a bite of what he'd made, considered it. This is better than the eggs, she said. High bar, it clears it though, definitively. I'll take definitively. You should. It's better than almost. She looked at him across the table. Almost is what other people settle for. He looked at his daughter, the gap-toothed smile that had closed into something more complete, the eyes that were her mother's, the directness that was all her own. And he thought about how much of what he'd built, and was still building, had started in this kitchen, in this specific ordinariness, in the particular life of a man who had lost something enormous, and had decided in the grief of it to build something that outlasted the loss. You're right, he said. Almost is what other people settle for. The kitchen was warm, the dinner was imperfect. The evening was quiet in the way that good evenings were quiet, not empty, but full of the right kind of nothing. Outside, San Francisco kept doing what it always did, indifferent and extraordinary. Inside, a father and his daughter ate dinner and talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. This was what got built in the end, not the contract, not the $3.2 billion, not the ethics clause or the restructured terms or the values paragraph in plain language. All of that mattered. All of that was real. But underneath it, the reason any of it had been worth fighting for was this. The kitchen, the dinner. The girl across the table who had told him, at 11 years old, that the way people treat you when they think you don't matter is the most honest thing they'll ever show you. She had been right. And Caleb Walker, who had stood still while the room judged him, and had wiped wine from his face with a handkerchief, and had said 8 words that changed the course of $3.2 billion. Caleb Walker had always known it. He had simply been waiting for the world to catch up.